Thank you very much. It's also available in bookshops for those of you who don't buy online. Need to support our bookshops. It's Love Your Bookshop Day today. Now, it's 100 years this coming October since Alfred Deakin died. And in that time, since his death, and particularly since the 1980s, his reputation has pretty much declined, and he's fallen a little, I think, out of popular memory, which is one of the reasons that I wrote the biography. He has become associated very much with the protective policies of what Paul Kelly called the Australian settlement, that Australia, in a sense, turned away from the 1980s onwards, the sort of white Australia, the restricted immigration policy and particularly protective tariffs. What I want to talk about today, though, is, I think, a more enduring legacy. I think when we think about Deakin's relevance to today, it's not really the policies which he stood for so much as his statecraft. And that's on display in his enduring, in the work that he did for Federation. And I got asked to speak about Alfred Deakin and Federation to you today. And so what I've got is effectively a narrative history, really, of the contribution that he made. He became committed to the cause of Federation when he was a young minister serving in the cabinet of James Service, who was the Victorian Premier at the time, who'd won the election in 1883. The platform that Service won on included the commitment to work for Federation of the Australian colonies, and a federal council had just been established, so it wasn't an unrealistic ambition at that point, though it was going to take another 17 years to be achieved. For the Victorians in the 1880s, in the early 1880s, the cause of Federation was intertwined with their desire for Britain to annex the New Hebrides. The Dutch had controlled the western half of New Guinea since 1828. France had annexed New Caledonia in 1853 and Britain Fiji in 1874. The other islands in Australia's northeast, including the eastern half of New Guinea, were as yet unclaimed by European power, and the Australians thought that Britain should get in there and claim them. But Britain had no interest in claiming new territory in the Pacific. Service believed that a federated Australia would not only be better able to persuade the British to its point of view, but it would also have the financial capacity to contribute to the administrative costs of these territories, which Britain was sure to demand. These entwined dreams of Services, of federation and an Australian imperial presence in the Pacific became Deakin's dream. Deakin was very influenced by those years that he worked, that he served under Service. Only if the colonies were federated, Deakin believed, would they be entitled to speak with the authority of a united people, and so press their demands on the British government. Now, Deakin was born in Melbourne in 1856. He's native-born, and his views were shared by other young native-born men, especially those of the Victorian-based Australian Natives Association, which was a friendly society, but that took up political causes and effectively turned itself during the 1880s into a political pressure group. These sons of the soil regarded themselves as having a special responsibility for national questions, and Deakin joined the Paran branch in 1884. And as his star rose, he became their most celebrated member. In 1884, he'd already been a Member of Parliament for 4 years, and he was, conspicuously young. He's in his mid to late 20s. The colony of Victoria during the 1880s was riding a wave of prosperity, and marvellous Melbourne was in full swing. By 1885, Deakin was the leader of the Liberal Party and Chief Secretary in the coalition government. In 1887, he's aged 31, he goes on his first visit to London as a member of the Victorian delegation to the Imperial Conference, and there he audaciously challenges the British Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury, over Britain's reluctance to annex the New Hebrides. I don't think Deakin quite realised how audacious he was being, but having been born in Australia, he hadn't grown up with the sort of deference towards class, which the immigrant-born politicians that he went with still had. He also, on this trip, refused a knighthood. So he returned from London a local celebrity. And the young men of the ANA, and now there he is, saw him as representing the future of young Australia as a proud federated nation. And this is his handsome profile surrounded by wattle wreaths on the program of the banquet that the ANA gave to him to welcome him home. Now, nothing much had come from this federal council established in the early 1880s. And in 1889, the cause of federation was revived by the ageing New South Wales Premier Henry Parkes. In his Tenterfield address, Parkes called for a national convention to devise a national government. 2 conventions were held where the first draft of the Constitution was hammered out, and the plan was that this would then be endorsed by the colonial parliaments. Now, if this was to happen, if all the colonial parliaments were going to endorse the Constitution, then there needed to be a balance between the sovereignty of the smaller colonies and the democratic rights of the majority of the population who lived in Victoria and New South Wales. Deakin was at both these conferences, and he realised that if federation were going to be achieved, the compromises were going to be needed between, if you like, the demands of the smaller states and democratic majoritarianism. Now, the institutional framework of this first draft constitution has endured. The popularly elected lower house and upper house with equal representation of the colonies/states and equal powers except for money bills. But there were some serious reservations about this first draft. Deakin and his fellow Victorians were uncomfortable about the upper house having any powers over money bills at all. There was no agreed means of resolving deadlocks between the 2 houses, and the unequal representation of the Senate rankled with majoritarian Democrats' commitment to votes of equal value, as did the indirect election of the Senate, where it would be elected by state parliaments, which was what was in the first draft constitution. Deakin was a committed Democrat, but he knew that if federation was to be achieved, the majoritarian Democrats would have to give way. Now, this draft constitution, as I'm sure all the members of this organisation know, was largely the work of Queensland's Samuel Griffith, Tasmanians Andrew Inglis Clark, South Australia's Charles Kingston and New South Wales' Edmund Toby Barton. The last 2, Kingston and Barton, would have become Deakin's comrades in arms as they led the federation cause in their respective states. Both were some years older than Deakin, but they were native-born lawyers like him, with around a decade of parliamentary experience each. Now, the convention, where the first draft constitution was produced, settled on the name of the federation, that it would be called the Commonwealth of Australia. This was Henry Parkes' choice, but Deakin seconded it, and he lobbied energetically for it against the suspicion that the Commonwealth was the overtones were Republican. Deakin judged that convention had been fairly successful, but in the early 1890s, there wasn't a great deal of popular enthusiasm for federation. The colonies were all suffering from major depression, and people's minds were actually on economic matters and surviving, and the governments were preoccupied with getting their finances back in order after a decade of pretty heavy borrowing in the 1880s. In 1893, a People's Conference at Corowa revived the cause and came up with a plan that took the process out of the hands of politicians and gave it to the people. Voters in each colony would elect representatives to a convention, which would determine a federal constitution bill, which would then be submitted to referenda in the different colonies. Federationists then could now move beyond talk to start mobilising support for the forthcoming popular vote. Now, this was the cause Deakin had been waiting for. The boom of the 1880s had come to a shuddering end, especially in Victoria, and the crisis had shaken Deakin's faith in politics. In 1890, he resigned from the Victorian ministry, and he basically spent the next decade on the backbench. He thought about leaving politics altogether, but what held him there was the cause of federation. Federation essentially became a redemption project for him, as it did for many Victorians. So after Corowa, Deakin starts working tirelessly for federation. He says, long ago he had made up his mind that no question should be put second to federation from either the local or national standpoint. The best remedy that could be applied to all the ills, political, social and financial, from which Australia was suffering would be immediate federation. Deakin had two great political gifts, his oratory and his charm. He could bring a public meeting to its feet, and in private he could talk away doubts and negotiate a compromise. Both of these were acts of persuasion, and he exercised both in the hard work of achieving federation. He also brought himself, the brilliant native-born man whose upright and independent public persona embodied the spirit of the emerging nation. Deakin was elected as a Victorian delegate to the convention that would settle the constitution and that was to put it to the people. He was the only Victorian who'd been at the previous conventions, and this, I think, had alerted him to what compromises were going to be necessary. His staunchest ally was Edmund Barton. Now, who do I point this at? There he is. There's Deakin with Edmund Barton in 1898, when they're comrades in arms for the cause of federation. Deakin was determined to do everything he could to achieve this. He says, "Were it a question today of accepting the Commonwealth Bill or postponing federation even for a few years, I should, without hesitation, accept the Constitution Bill," he said in his opening speech to the convention. "It is perhaps possible for us to fail altogether in our high aim, and we may easily fall short, yet it is certain to be a long time before such another opportunity can present itself. Political opportunities of this sort, if missed, rarely return again in the same generation," as people who argued for the Australian Republic well know. The big problem then was how to resolve the democratic demands for majority rule that were being particularly pushed by George Reid, the Premier of New South Wales, with the small states' fears of being swamped by... It was absolutely essential that there would be some compromise sorted out here. Let me just speed up. So Deakin turned his full persuasive powers on the federationists from the small colonies. On a trip to Broken Hill, with two other Victorians, he persuaded three Tasmanians to support a compromise, that they must be content to allow the Senate to make suggestions and not amendments in money bills unless they wish to shipwreck the whole bill. And so this is him exercising his charm, if you like, and persuasive powers behind the scenes. And the limitation of the Senate's money powers passed by a single vote, and the bill was saved. Time and again during the debates, Deakin argued that the fears of the small states were unfounded. He said the Senate was not going to operate on the basis of state identities and loyalties, but it would operate effectively as a party's house, which is, as we know, what happened. He also argued that the federation principle and the endurance of state sovereignty would be protected by the Constitution rather than by the Senate. It was the Constitution and the High Court that would protect would be the real effective guarantor of the state's rights. He was correct in his assessment of how the Senate would operate as a party's house, not so correct in his assessment about the Constitution's effectiveness in protecting the rights of the states. So after the convention, the Constitution settled, the next step is a referenda. And in early 1898, when it's just before it's about to go to the people, the prospects were not looking particularly good. The age, in particular in Victoria, was very worried about the democratic watering down of the Constitution. It looked set to oppose, to try to persuade people to vote no, which would have been a disaster in Victoria. David Syme, who was the editor, was pressuring Deakin to withdraw his support from the Constitution. Deakin was but instead Deakin made a speech which turned the tide. It was delivered without notes to a banquet of the ANA at the Shamrock Hotel in Bendigo, and it was the supreme oratorical feat of Deakin's life, as he told the men of the Australian Natives Association that their hour had come. "These are times that try men's souls," he said, "but it is not a time to surrender. Let us nail our standard to the mast. Let us stand shoulder to shoulder in defence of the enlightened liberalism of the Constitution. The contest in which you are about to engage is one in which it is a privilege to be enrolled. It lifts your labours to the loftiest political levels, where they may be inspired with the purest patriotic passion for national life and being." And this speech turns the tide, and the Australian natives Association, in a sense, provides the organisational base for the campaign, the Yes campaign in the referenda, because they have branches in every little country town and suburbs. Victoria embraced the bill. Not so New South Wales, where at that first referendum they voted no. There's a meeting of the premiers that are then held to come to some sort of compromise. Reid calls it, he's offering a way forward. Deakin's not at that because he's not the Premier and he's not a Member of Parliament, but he urges the Premier, George Turner, to cooperate with Reid and suggests to him the compromise on the location of the capital. And the Premiers agree. Now, Deakin could set out the arguments for and rebut those against the Constitution, as well as any of the other Federationists. His special gift was to create the imagination of Australia as an object worthy of sacrifice and devotion and elevated above sectional and parochial interests. He appealed to the idea of the nation, which had captured the 19th century Western political imagination, that a people united by territory, history, religion, race and culture should be joined under a political rule to which they gave consent. Once federation was achieved, Deakin became Attorney-General in the Commonwealth Government, and after Edmund Barton retired to the High Court, its second Prime Minister. When the Constitution was finally law and the Commonwealth inaugurated, Deakin saw it as the duty of those who'd argued for federation to make it work. This is a photo of him in 1903 when he becomes Prime Minister for the first time. So he saw that there was a duty of those who'd argued for federation to make it work, that it was like there was a compact between those federationists and the people and their elected representatives. The Constitution provided a framework for the government of the nation, but that was all it was. It was only a framework. Federal institutions had to be built and federal laws had to be passed for areas of federal responsibility. Support for the federation slumped in those early years once the voters realised how expensive it was going to be and once the states realised what they'd given up. There was a real danger in those early years that if the Commonwealth governments failed, the new federation itself might have failed. So federal sentiment and a wide federal perspective had to be nurtured. Again and again, in the speeches that Deakin makes after federation, he conjures up the map of Australia and he tells his audience that they're no longer just Victorians or South Australians or Tasmanians, they're now also Australians. And what I want to say to you today is that this was, I think, Deakin's great mission after federation, was to make real the promise of a nation that was carried in the Constitution. And I'm just going to finish with a copy of my book cover. And that's a less official photo of Deakin. That's him on the shores of, on the beach at Point Lonsdale, where he and the family had a holiday house. And you can see what a strong and handsome man he was. That's taken in 1910, when he's just lost the election to Labor, to the first majority government was being elected, and when he's starting to suffer from early onset Alzheimer's, which over the next decade really destroys his very fine mind. Now, I think I've got time for a couple of questions.